This is the final part of Stave 3 of A Christmas Carol. We'll see Scrooge's nephew's party with the ghost of Christmas present bringing Scrooge along, and the parting of this second ghost of Christmas. We're dropped into the middle of a scene where Scrooge and the ghost of Christmas present arrive at the party, and everyone is in the middle of a great big laugh. And Scrooge recognizes that this is his nephew's house. Ha 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 ha! Oh, he said that Christmas was a humbug. As I live, cried Scrooge's nephew. He believed it, too. More shame for him, Fred, said Scrooge's niece indignantly. Bless those women. They never do anything by halves. They are always in earnest. She was very pretty, exceedingly pretty, with a dimpled, surprised-looking capital face, a ripe little mouth that seemed made to be kissed, as no doubt it was, and all kinds of good little dots about her chin that melted into one another when she laughed, and the sunniest pair of eyes you ever saw in any little creature's head. Altogether, she was what you would have called provoking, but satisfactory, too. Oh, perfectly satisfactory. He's a comical old fellow, said Scrooge's nephew. That's the truth, and not so unpleasant as he might be. However, his offenses carry their own punishment, and I have nothing to say against him. Oh, I'm sure he is very rich, Fred, hinted Scrooge's niece. At least you tell me so. What of that, my dear, said Scrooge's nephew. His wealth is of no use to him. He don't do any good with it. He don't make himself comfortable with it. He hasn't the satisfaction of thinking that he is ever going to benefit us with it. I have no patience with him, observed Scrooge's niece. Scrooge's niece's sisters and all the other ladies expressed the same opinion. Oh, I have, said Scrooge's nephew. I am sorry for him. I couldn't be angry with him if I tried. Who suffers by his ill whims? Himself, always. Here he takes it into his head to dislike us, and he won't come and dine with us. What's the consequence? He don't lose much of a dinner. Indeed, I think he loses a very good dinner, interrupted Scrooge's niece. Everybody else said the same, and they must be allowed to have been competent judges, because they had just had dinner, and with the dessert upon the table were clustered round the fire by lamplight. Well, I'm very glad to hear it, said Scrooge's nephew, because I haven't great faith in these young housekeepers. What do you say, Topper? Topper had clearly got his eye upon one of Scrooge's niece's sisters, for he answered that a bachelor was a wretched outcast who had no right to express an opinion on the subject. Whereat Scrooge's niece's sister, the plump one with the lace tucker, not the one with the roses, blushed. Do go on, Fred, said Scrooge's niece, clapping her hands. He never finishes what he begins to say. He's such a ridiculous fellow. Scrooge's nephew reveled in another laugh, and it was impossible to keep the infection off, though the plump sister tried hard to do it with an aromatic vinegar. His example was unanimously followed. I was only going to say, said Scrooge's nephew, that the consequence of his taking a dislike to us and not making merry with us is, as I think, that he loses some pleasant moments, which could do him no harm. I'm sure he loses pleasanter companions than he can find in his own thoughts, either in his moldy old office or his dusty chambers. I mean to give him the same chance every year, whether he likes it or not, for I pity him. He may rail at Christmas until he dies, but he can't help thinking better of it. I defy him. If he finds me going there in good temper, year after year, and saying, Uncle Scrooge, how are you? If it only puts him in the vein to leave his poor clerk 50 pounds, that's something. And I think I shook him yesterday. It was their turn to laugh now at the notion of his shaking Scrooge, but being thoroughly good-natured and not much caring what they laughed at, so that they laughed at any rate, he encouraged them in their merriment and passed the bottle joyously. I'm going to skip ahead in the next section, but I'm going to ask you to pause the video for a moment and take a couple of notes that answer the question. I'm going to skip over some really neat games that they play, so if you want to go back and read this section, you'll see what some of those are. Some games we still play today, like charades, and then some other ones you may never have heard of that are still kind of neat to watch. It is also interesting, this Topper character, how he treats one of the young ladies at the party. But Let's take a moment now, pause here, and restart the video after you've written this down. Write down anything that happened or anything that was said that had a change on Scrooge. All right, I hope you paused the video to take a quick note because we are going to jump in. We skipped through some of the games Scrooge was watching. Scrooge was getting into the games himself, even though no one there could see him or watch how he was participating or acknowledge his correct answers. But he was having a great time anyway, getting right into all the games. And now we come to one more game. The ghost was greatly pleased to find him in this mood, and looked upon him with such favor that he begged like a boy to be allowed to stay until the guests departed. But this, the spirit said, could not be done. "Here's a new game," said Scrooge. "1 half hour, spirit. Only one." It was a game called Yes and No, where Scrooge's nephew had to think of something and the rest must find out what. He only answering their questions yes or no, as the case was. The brisk fire of questioning to which he was exposed elicited from him that he was thinking of an animal, a live animal, a rather disagreeable animal, a savage animal, an animal that growled and grunted sometimes and talked sometimes and lived in London and walked about the streets and wasn't made a show of, and wasn't led by anybody, and didn't live in a menagerie, and was never killed in a market, and it was not a horse, or an ass, or a cow, or a bull, or a tiger, or a dog, or a pig, or a cat, or a bear. At every fresh question that was put to him, this nephew burst out into a fresh roar of laughter, and was so inexpressibly tickled that he was obliged to get up off the sofa and stamp. Oh, at last the plump sister, falling into a similar state, cried out, I found it out. I know what it is, Fred. I know what it is." "What is it?" cried Fred. "It's your Uncle Scrooge." Which it certainly was. Admiration was the universal sentiment, though some objected that the reply to, "Is it a bear?" ought to have been yes, inasmuch as an answer in the negative was sufficient to have diverted their thoughts from Mr. Scrooge, supposing they ever had any tendency that way. "He has given us plenty of merriment, I am sure," said Fred, "and it would be ungrateful not to drink to his health. Here is a glass of mulled wine ready at our hand at the moment, and I say, Uncle Scrooge." "Well, Uncle Scrooge," they cried, "a Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year to the old man, wherever he is," said Scrooge's nephew. "He wouldn't take it from me, but he may have it nevertheless, to Uncle Scrooge." Uncle Scrooge had imperceptibly become so gay and light of heart that he would have pledged the unconscious company in return and thanked them in an inaudible speech if the ghost had given him time. But the whole scene passed off in the breath of the last words spoken by his nephew, and he and the spirit were again upon their travels. I'm going to ask you to pause the video again to take a couple of notes of some things that you've seen change Scrooge, and then click play again when you're ready to move on after you've taken some notes. Pause here. Welcome back. Now we're jumping ahead a little bit to the very end of this stave. And Scrooge is starting to notice that the ghost of Christmas Present has been getting older and older and older as the night has gone on. And it seems like his time might just about be up. It was strange, too, that while Scrooge remained unaltered in his outward form, the ghost grew older, clearly older. Scrooge had observed this change, but never spoke of it until they left a children's 12th night party when, looking at the spirit as they stood together in an open place, he noticed that its hair was gray. "Are spirits' lives so short?" asked Scrooge. "My life upon this globe is very brief," replied the ghost. "It ends tonight." "Tonight?" cried Scrooge. "Tonight at midnight. Hark! The time is drawing near." The chimes were ringing the 3/4 past. "Forgive me if I am not justified in what I ask," said Scrooge. looking intently at the spirit's robe. But I see something